2 years ago, on February 24th, 2022, Russia launched a massive invasion of neighboring Ukraine. The UN responded by expelling Russia from the UN Human Rights Council, and the International Criminal Court issued an arrest warrant for Russian President Vladimir Putin. Despite massive force, Russia failed to capture Ukraine's largest cities or topple Ukraine's government. The fighting has ground to a bloody stalemate with hundreds of thousands of casualties on both sides. What is the likely endgame for the Russian-Ukraine conflict? I'm Michael Scharf, Dean of Case Western Reserve University's School of Law. In this broadcast of Talking Foreign Policy, I've assembled a group of experts who will be discussing how the world's most pressing conflict is likely to conclude. Welcome to Talking Foreign Policy, the quarterly radio show and podcast produced by Case Western Reserve University and IdeaStream Public Media. I'm your host, Michael Scharf, Dean of Case Western Reserve University School of Law. Today, we're going to be talking about where things are heading in the Russia-Ukraine conflict. I've assembled an all-star panel of experts. From Kiev, Ukraine, I am pleased to welcome Daniel Bilek, partner at Kinstler Law Firm and former chief advisor to the Prime Minister of Ukraine. Daniel also serves in the Territorial Defense Forces, a branch of Ukraine's military. Welcome to Talking Foreign Policy, Daniel.
Great to be here. Thank you.
And joining us from the nation's capital is Kevin Nealer, a former State Department official who is currently one of the heads of the prestigious Scowcroft Group. Hey, Kevin.
Honored to be here, Michael.
And from Houston, Texas, we are joined by retired Major General Darrell Guthrie, who has had a decorated 4-decade career in the U.S. Army. Welcome, Major General.
Hey, Michael. Thanks for having me.
And from Arlington, Virginia, we are joined once again by Dr. Paul Williams, famed peace negotiator and president of the Public International Law and Policy Group. Hey, Paul.
Thanks, Mike. It's great to be here again.
And with me in the IdeaStream studio is Cleveland State's distinguished university professor Milena Stereo, one of the country's foremost experts in international law.
It's great to be here.
So let's start off with Milena. Milena, can you give us a quick explanation of why Russia invaded Ukraine in 2014 and 2022?
Sure, Michael. The key event precipitating the 2014 invasion of Crimea might have been the fact that Ukraine had a revolution of some sort in 2013. Ukraine started turning towards the West, starting expressing its desire to join NATO. And more specifically, Russia and Ukraine had back in 2010 negotiated an agreement in Kharkiv that had allowed the Russian Black Sea Fleet to be stationed in Crimea up until 2042 for a very long time. And Ukraine, as it started turning towards the West, announced that it was ready to essentially get rid of that agreement, which would have then meant that Russia no longer could keep its Black Sea Fleet in Crimea. All of that precipitated Russia's decision to then invade Crimea and also attack the eastern part of Ukraine in the Donbass region. And to some extent, those attacks were what one might call rationally calculated. Fast forward to 2022, Putin decided to launch a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, which many thought of as a lot more irrational because it is easier to get away with snatching little parts of Ukrainian territory that the West was globally willing to accept. It's quite another to say we're going to launch a full-scale invasion. Lots of reasons could be cited as to why Putin decided to do this in 2022. Many believe it had to do with two things. One, again, is Ukraine's willingness to essentially turn more and more towards the West. President Zelensky's election in 2019 and Putin's perception of him as someone who he could not control, but also Putin's own megalomania, Putin's own desire to make sure that Russia is seen as a world power and that he himself is seen as this amazing global leader.
All right, with that background, let's bring in some reality. Daniel Billick is actually in Kiev, and you won't believe it because the connection is really clear thanks to IdeaStream's technology. But Daniel, you've been in Ukraine throughout the war. Can you describe the damage that has been done by Russia's invasion and its continuing attacks?
It's really hard to describe in words. I mean, you have to see the pictures, but I mean, you're dealing with what is essentially a genocidal terrorist state, and the Russians have nothing to offer and bring nothing but destruction, despair, and death wherever they go. And they specialize in fighting against civilian populations, especially. They've razed cities, like Bakhmut in Donbass, which had 70,000 people living in there, and it's nothing but rubble now. Avdiivka in Donbass is exactly the same place, Izum and Kharkiv, and now they're bombing major cities. They're bombing Kharkiv in the east. You had a family that would, in a village that had burned to death the other day. Five members. The oldest child was 7, 5, and 7 months, and it's just awful. They missile attacks on civilian infrastructure. I mean, we've seen it here in Kiev since October of 2022. They bomb energy plants, ports, apartment buildings. 30% of our territory is mined. That's about the size of Colorado or Oregon. And right now, Ukraine is the most mined country on earth. But I think the biggest damage is the human cost. I mean, 13 million people have been displaced, 15,000 have been killed, and at least 30,000 injured. And, tragically, we have, 50,000 people that have lost their limbs, whether it's soldiers to artillery or civilians, even with walking over mines. But, I have to say, Ukrainians are resistant, resilient, and we're resolute. 3 million people have returned home from abroad. Schools and services operate in most of the cities, in different ways. My kids now go 1 week offline, 1 week online because their school has a bomb shelter that can only house half of the students at any one period of time, but they adapt. GDP fell by 25% in 2022 when when the invasion started, but we had 4% economic growth in 2023, and we try to repair our infrastructure as fast as it's damaged. So, when you're defending your own land, you adapt and you fight.
And Daniel, in the United States, if you drive around the cities, you'll see a lot of these yellow and blue flags. There's a lot of support among the American people for the really brave souls that you're describing in the Ukraine. Let's turn to General Guthrie. General, can you give us a sense of where things stand militarily in the conflict between Russia and Ukraine?
Yes, Michael. And so, kind of the first thing is these views are my own, but I really do want to acknowledge the great reporting and analysis that's coming out of the Institute for the Study of War and War on the Rocks that have assisted in me shaping my views. So first, I would say that there are 4 key factors that are militarily at play. So first, the conflict is generally at a stalemate along the very long 600 plus mile line of contact. And Ukraine is defending along the entire front while Russia pushes to recapture the remainder of the Luhansk Oblast and hope to move into the eastern Kharkiv Oblast so they can threaten Ukraine's second largest city, Kharkiv. And they hope to capture the entirety of the Donetsk Oblast. So second, Russia has achieved a fire's advantage in artillery ammunition, missiles, and drones with the assistance of North Korea and Iran. This fire's advantage may now be as much as 5-1, which positions Russia to continue to attrit the Ukrainian forces or transition to the offense. Third, Russia's air and missile and drone campaign against the military and defense industrial infrastructure is having an impact as Ukrainian forces deal with air defense system ammunition shortages. And in other words, the Russians are forcing Ukraine to make difficult decisions about what they may shoot down. And last, whether a recent change in Ukraine military leadership will have a positive or negative impact, and whether the possibility of additional mobilizations can fill gaps in existing formations and build new formations needed for future offensive operations remain open questions. So in sum, the conflict is at a stalemate and will likely stay that way until 2025 as both sides attempt to reposition and reconstitute equipment and people. One bright spot: the Russian Black Fleet has largely repositioned out of Crimea, which has permitted significant improvements in imports and exports via its controlled major ports.
So, General, can you tell us about what military aid the United States and the Europeans have been providing Ukraine?
Yep. So, from an equipping standpoint, the U.S. and Europe have provided a variety of tanks, anti-tank weapons like the Javelin, artillery to include the HIMARS system that greatly assisted Ukrainian gains in the fall of 2022, air defense systems, and importantly, ammunition. Now, the timing of arrival of equipment aid has been problematic, but the promised F-16s, M1 Abrams tanks, MLRS, and ATACMS medium-range rockets have arrived or are now arriving. It's even my understanding that Turkey is even building a drone factory inside Ukraine. But honestly, this equipment was too late to impact the summer 2023 Ukrainian offensive, and the logistics requirements to maintain and repair these very complex systems remain somewhat uncertain. So additionally, the U.S. and Europe have provided training on combined arms maneuver, although there are questions about whether the training was sufficient to allow Ukraine to conduct battalion and brigade level operations that are going to be necessary to successfully attack the integrated Russian defense. Finally, there's been intelligence sharing, planning assistance, and access to things like commercial satellite systems like Starlink that have been really important.
So, the way you describe it, it sounds like a lot of this assistance is just now arriving and will have a major effect. And yet in the news, we're hearing a lot about the fact that the Ukraine is running out of their weaponry. Can you reconcile those two views for us?
Yeah, let me see if I can. And I think what you have to say is that it's now really about artillery and air defense system ammunition. There's also a need for enablers like mine clearing equipment, obstacle breaching equipment, short range air defense systems, and counter electronic warfare type equipment. So the Russians have adapted just like Ukraine has adapted to various weapon systems. And so now you're starting to see these needs to be able to apply maybe slightly more esoteric equipment that you need maybe to breach a complex minefield. And so that's one issue. But I think most critical is this ammunition point. So Mike Kaufman, who's with War on the Rocks, he estimates that Ukraine's daily artillery ammunition requirement is about 3,000 rounds per day, or 90,000 rounds per month. So currently they're operating on about 2/3 of this requirement. And what that means is again, now commanders have to make really tough decisions about where you're going to utilize artillery fire, maybe to stop a Russian attack, or whether you're going to be able to support sufficiently your own counterattack. Now, there's some good news on the horizon, assuming Congress comes through. U.S. production has almost tripled to 36,000 rounds per month of 155 artillery ammunition. And while Europe is expanding its artillery ammunition production, they are behind schedule. And so to reach their 1 million round per year target, it's probably not going to happen until the end of 2024. And that's really why I say this is going to be a year of reconstitution, really on both sides.
So, General, that's a great way of explaining to us their needs. It's time for a short break. When we return, I'm going to start with Kevin Nealor and have him tell us about the domestic political situation in the United States that affects the continuing military assistance to Ukraine. And then we're going to talk about the prospects of a possible Russian-Ukraine peace agreement. So stay with us. Welcome back to Talking Foreign Policy, brought to you by Case Western Reserve University and IdeaStream Public Media. I'm Michael Scharf, Dean of Case Western Reserve University School of Law. We're joined today from Kiev, Ukraine, by Daniel Bilek, the former advisor to the Prime Minister of Ukraine. From Houston, Texas, by Daryl Guthrie, a decorated Army general. From Washington, D.C., by Kevin Nealor, head of the Scowcroft Group. From Arlington, Virginia, by Paul Williams, the president of the Public International Law and Policy Group, and here in the IdeaStream studio by Professor Melania Stereo of Cleveland State University College of Law. In this segment of our show, we're going to be discussing the prospects of a possible Russia-Ukraine peace agreement. But first, I want to turn to Kevin Nealor. We were talking about the needs of Ukraine to continue to get military aid from the United States, or things are going to get really rough. Now, Kevin, you spent 5 years working on national security issues with Senate leadership. Can you describe the political situation in the United States relating to continuing to provide military support to Ukraine?
Michael, nothing in that time I spent in the Senate, and I have to say it was more than a decade ago in a much more highly functional Senate, quite prepares me for where we are now. It's probably important to say that the grim reality that Daniel described and the military situation that General Guthrie laid out to us in such an excellent fashion, that's being briefed real time, obviously. There's a high degree, a very granular degree of awareness on Capitol Hill of exactly what our colleagues in Ukraine are facing. And still, there isn't the felt sense of urgency. We're grinding at what many of us regard as an unacceptably slow pace of the legislative process. As you know, late last year, House GOP members and about a dozen senators announced that Ukraine support would depend on a border security bill. Now, we all know that the currency of legislation on Capitol Hill is horse trading, but this was a rather extreme example of that in taking hostage such an urgent issue. Senator McConnell and Schumer appointed Senator Langford, one of the most conservative members of the Senate, Chris Murphy, and also Senator Sinema to head a working group. They produced a bipartisan bill on the border issues. But then we had former President Trump come out and announce opposition to any bill and turning it into a personal loyalty test. And that's resulted in Speaker Johnson's decision not even to allow a vote on a compromised border matter. And that's standing in the doorway, precluding a vote on Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan assistance, all of which are vital. The process is supposed to be that each house votes, there's a conference committee, and differences between bills are worked out. Not even allowing a vote on a matter of profound national security interest is really a stunning failure of the job Congress is supposed to be doing. Over the weekend, we did have some good news. The Senate cleared a procedural hurdle and moved forward on a combined foreign aid bill for all three countries we mentioned. It has no border measure features at all. Now, that bill is likely to face probably 2 or 3 more procedural votes in the Senate just this week. And then we're left seeing if Speaker Johnson is prepared to let Ukraine aid collapse or he's going to take up a vote. You wouldn't think that voting on a matter would be a hard choice for a leader of either party. Senator McConnell, to his credit, has made clear that he's staking his reputation and his stature in the Senate on this Ukraine vote. And you've just had your Republican congressman from Ohio who heads the Intelligence Committee, Mr. Turner, come back from Kyiv and say that he is hopeful that Johnson will support a vote. But I'll be honest with you, it's just not clear today whether or not that's going to happen. By the end of the week, I think we're going to have a lot more clarity.
And Kevin, I should mention to you, because you're a Case Western Law alum, that Michael Turner, who you just mentioned, is also an alum of the law school. But thank you, Kevin, for providing a look inside the sausage factory of American politics. Let's turn to our peace negotiator, Paul Williams. Paul, with the fighting at a stalemate, there have been press reports that Ukraine and Russia are growing interested in negotiating an end to the Russian-Ukraine war. Paul, do you think Russia is really ready to negotiate an end to the war in good faith?
No.
Okay. And can you elaborate, please?
Michael, I think we have to be very careful about falling into the trap of we're exhausted by this war, and so let's just pressure the Ukrainians to sit down at the table with the Russians, hash it out, trade a little territory for peace, and then we can move on with whatever else is that we're doing. This is an existential threat to Ukraine, to the European Union or the Western Europe, to NATO, and to the United States. We rely on this global world order that we've helped to construct for our peace and our prosperity. This threat is directed right at the heart of that peace and prosperity, and pushing the Ukrainians into a Potemkin negotiation is only going to play into the hands of Russia to erode the support of the West and the growing support of the global community in the global South for Ukraine. So, let's not be fooled by a Trojan horse of a peace negotiation.
All right. Well, let me ask this question as a hypothetical then for Milena Stereo. Let's assume that the U.S. military aid continues on, that Ukraine and Daniel's brave comrades continue to fight it out, and the stalemate just goes on, and finally Russia is truly ready to negotiate. What would you think might be the key components of such a deal from Russia's perspective? What are they going to be looking for?
From Russia's perspective, I think there are a couple of things that they would definitely be looking for. One, I think, would be the recognition that Crimea has, through a Russian staged referendum, but Russia would say through a free and fair referendum, expressed its preference to separate from Ukraine and become a part of Russia. And so I think Russia would want Ukraine to confirm the territorial integrity of Crimea as a part of Russia. And I think Crimea is strategically very important to Russia, in part because of its Black Sea fleet that can be stationed there. I think Russia would also want some kind of significant political autonomy for the Donbass region, where even if it could nominally de jure stay within Ukrainian control, it would have significant autonomy, and Russia would essentially be able to exert all sorts of influence there. And then Russian leaders might be looking for some type of amnesty, some type of reassurance that Putin and his leaders, his allies, would not be prosecuted in the International Criminal Court or some other accountability mechanism.
And let me ask, do you think they would ask for Ukraine to have some kind of neutrality rather than join NATO?
And absolutely. Part of what might have pushed Putin into invading Crimea and then fast forward to 2022 to launch a full-scale invasion was Ukrainian expression of will to join NATO. I think Russia would most definitely want Ukraine to promise that it would not try to join NATO.
All right, so let me turn to Daniel Bilek. Now, Daniel, I'm asking you this in your personal capacity, not as the former advisor to the Prime Minister of Ukraine. But what do you think might be the key components of a peace deal from Ukraine's perspective?
Well, I think we all have to get real about what we're talking about. There's not a peace deal, there's no such thing as a peace deal with Vladimir Putin, certainly in any configuration that we can envision today. To talk about a peace deal is basically evidence-free speculation. I mean, everything he has talked about is that he's still pursuing his maximalist goals of a complete elimination of Ukrainian identity and statehood. This is not a war about land or territory, unless it's all of Ukrainian territory. I mean, he doesn't want just the Donbass, and he doesn't want southern Ukraine. He doesn't even want just the Crimea. He wants to change the world order, and he was very explicit about that at the Valdai conference at the end of last year. This is a fundamental reorientation of the world order towards the so-called axis of evil 2.0, if you like, with Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, and whoever else, what other degenerates want to join it. This is a war of extermination. And Secretary Blinken once said, very aptly, that if the Russian Federation stops fighting, the war is finished. If Ukraine stops fighting, Ukraine is finished. And that's what we're facing. And the Ukrainian people know that too. 90% of Ukrainians, even today, after 2 years with everything we've gone through, do not want to give up 1 square inch of territory. There's too much suffering that has gone on. I mean, what did we do that for? Giving up territory condemns 5 million people to slavery and slaughter. We forget that there are actually people living on that territory. And Alexander Matvichuk, who heads up the Center for Civil Liberties and was a Nobel Prize laureate recently, said, occupation is not peace. It's just another form of war. So, we get into this whole issue of whether you can trust anything he says, which you can't. I mean, if his lips are moving, he's lying, except when he talks about taking over Ukraine. And further, because you're not going to have peace, you're going to have a pause. And if we stop fighting now, it means that he's going to regroup, rearm, and he will reinvade the rest of Ukraine, and then he's going to go after the Baltic states and Poland. People say that he thinks he's the incarnation of Peter the Great. I think he's more the spawn of Stalin. He likes the borders of post World War II, 1946, where you had the Warsaw Pact countries under the tutelage of the Soviet Union, and that's what he'd be very happy with that today. And just to go back to something General Guthrie was talking about, and I think it's very apt, is that we are not getting a surge of equipment right now. We have had throughout this war metered incrementalism, if you like, of getting things, as the general points out, too little, too late, and not always the right stuff. And it's not that we're ungrateful. We're extremely grateful. If we didn't have the support of the people of the United States, and I wouldn't be here having this conversation with you, quite frankly. But we're talking about a bill for $61 billion, which is less than 5% of the Pentagon budget, and for $48 billion that the United States has spent over the last 2 years. That's a little bit more than that, but on military aid, we have destroyed 1/2 of the Russian army. We've destroyed 87% of the troops that they had at the beginning of the war. We've taken back 50% of our territory, and we had them on the back foot. But we couldn't get the equipment that we needed in the time that we needed. And now we're being starved. It's like being on life support. Instead of being in rehab, we're on life support. And this war is winnable. We need to have a peace negotiation, and that peace negotiation will be return to our 1991 sovereign borders, the defeat of the Russian army in Ukraine, reparations, and war crimes tribunal. This is what President Zelensky has been talking about since day one, and that's exactly where the rest of the country is too. He will not have any mandate to negotiate giving our territory back. I mean, I'm telling you, in my unit that I serve with, we'll throw stones at them if we have to, if we run out of ammunition. But sometimes it's better to die on your feet a free man than it is to live on your knees a slave. And that's what happens with people who are under Russian occupation. They end up being slaves.
Well, Daniel, that's extremely elegantly put. Let me turn back to Milena. Milena, you described what you thought Russia was after in a peace deal. We now have heard from Daniel how difficult it would be to get anything because of what Ukraine has gone through. Do you think there are any kinds of compromises that might gain traction in a couple of years?
it is a very difficult question because the Russian and the Ukrainian position seem to be very opposed. Ukraine is committed to a reaffirmation of its territorial integrity, including Crimea, all of the Donbass region, whereas Russia is not likely to be enticed into coming to the negotiating table, but for some type of a concession. Not to be super cynical about it, but I think Crimea might be the type of concession that Ukraine is willing to grant to Russia, because Ukraine, even in the history of the Soviet Union up until the 1950s, it was actually not a part of Ukraine, wasn't transferred to Ukraine until 1954 or so, and has a significant ethnic Russian population as well. I'm certainly not advocating for this approach, but I think that might be a concession that Ukraine might be in a position where they just have to go with that.
Paul, let me ask you, Daniel's made it really clear why Vladimir Putin cannot be trusted. You've done a whole bunch of peace negotiations between two sides that couldn't trust each other, and somehow you've made at least some of those work. What kinds of provisions can be added to make a peace agreement between two countries durable and enforceable?
Well, accountability. I think, Michael, if you're going to have a durable peace between Ukraine and Russia, you need to put the full support of the international community behind the International Criminal Court. We can say all kinds of things about President Putin. They're all true. We all saw the interview recently. But never forget the reality that he's responsible for atrocity crimes. He has been indicted by an international criminal tribunal for stealing children as an act of war, as an atrocity crime. Removing Putin and those that have supported him as he's committed the crime of aggression plus these atrocity crimes is crucial to the durable peace. In the countries that I've worked with, where they are now in a situation of a durable peace, you've had aggressive prosecution of those responsible for atrocity crimes. In places where you've done a deal with the devil, or where you've decided, oh, well, the leadership is an arsonist, but they're also the firemen, you don't actually have a durable peace. You have a return to conflict and even more violent conflict. So yes, you can do a peace deal once Putin is behind bars in The Hague. Then you'll have a possibility to build a durable peace along the lines of full return of territory, defeat of the Russian forces and removal from the territory.
All right, it is time for another short break. When we return, we're going to be discussing compensating the victims and prosecuting the perpetrators of the Russian-Ukraine conflict. We'll be back in a moment. This is Michael Scharf, Dean of Case Western Reserve University School of Law, and we're back with Talking Foreign Policy. I'm joined today by experts on the military, geopolitical, financial, and legal aspects of the Russian-Ukraine conflict, and we're talking about the likely endgame. In this final segment, we're going to be focusing on rebuilding Ukraine, ensuring its long-term security, and holding perpetrators responsible for war crimes. Let's start with the challenge of rebuilding Ukraine. The World Bank estimates that it will cost $411 billion to rebuild Ukraine after the war. Since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Western countries have frozen over $327 billion worth of Russian bank assets. That's nearly half of Russia's foreign reserves. And those frozen assets are generating tens of billions in interest. The EU has recently proposed sending that money to Ukraine to help rebuild the war-torn country. Daniel Bilek, as former financial advisor to the Ukraine, what can you tell us about this proposal?
Well, interest is interesting, but we want the corpus. We keep hearing about that's not possible because of issues of sovereign immunity. And frankly, I think the sovereign immunity issue is more a political impediment than it is legal in this case. because I think there are very distinct differences between a regular claim for sovereign immunity and what we have in the current situation. Actually, there are only three key players in this scenario. Belgium, which is host to Euroclear, so it's sitting on the bulk of the money at about 197 billion. The U.S. and the U.K. We had actually worked on a proposal with Paul's team, and it was a great honor to work with your team, Paul. And we came up with a proposal that each of these countries, Belgium with the EU, would amend their domestic public international law rules to allow for this to happen. That was one way to go. Interestingly enough, there's been a new proposal put forward by the G7, largely at the behest of the United States, to go to the capital markets, borrow the money of the corpus, the 300 plus billion, and that money, borrowed money, would be secured by the Russian central bank frozen assets. And when it came time to pay off the debt, essentially they would go to that fund. So Russia would ultimately pay as a matter of countermeasures, which is a well-recognized rule of public international law. And I think we need to appreciate one thing.
Go ahead.
Public international law is always evolving. And, it might be time to carve out a war of aggression, especially involving genocide and unlawful invasion, exception to claims of sovereign immunity. So, in law, as we all know, there's a clean hands doctrine. So if you want to come and claim sovereign immunity, you have to come with clean hands. And this is really an issue of fundamental justice and respect for international rules, I think.
So let me turn to Milena Stereo, who is one of the nation's foremost international law experts. You've heard Daniel. He's got some interesting theories, the clean hands doctrine, the aggression exception. How do you square that with the traditional view of international law? Is there anything here for movement?
Sure, Michael, that's a great question. And what I would just emphasize is that what is not controversial under international law is the seizure of foreign assets. What is more controversial is the capture of those assets and the repurposing of those assets towards reconstruction of the victim state. I think that Daniel is absolutely right that international law evolves. International law is not a static instrument. It's a dynamic instrument, and it might be time to argue in favor of new exceptions. Another possible pathway for this that I and other experts and the Public International Law and Policy Group have worked on is this argument that if you have a Ukrainian criminal court judgment against a Russian corporation, that other countries where Russian assets, not Russian state-owned, but Russian corporate assets are located, can actually enforce the Ukrainian criminal judgment and enforce the Ukrainian criminal judgment by seizing those Russian corporate assets in that jurisdiction and transferring them to Ukraine towards reconstruction. So I think as lawyers, it is our time to shine and to be innovative and to make sure that international law, I would say, properly evolves in this instance.
Well, it all sounds so easy, but whenever I need a dose of reality, I go to my colleague Kevin Nealor. Kevin, tell us about the geopolitical obstacles to accomplishing what Milena and Daniel are talking about, and what are the risks?
They're substantial, and Michael, as you know, I've got a great many of our clients who work in the financial services space, and they probably cringe if they listen to this broadcast. But I've got to say I agree with everything that Daniel and Milena have just said. I think Paul's sense of activism on this is absolutely right. Michael, what's the downside of retaliation? The reality is we've had 2 years where the sanctions, and we can get into a whole debate about the utility of sanctions. I think they've been more high functional than a lot of people recognize in dealing with Russia. Behavior modification, maybe not, but pressure undeniably. Well, that sanctions regime having been the backdrop for the last couple of years, any Western OECD firm that's still got significant Russia exposure is surfing the edge of a risk wave that their shareholders ought to be terrified by. So, when we think about retaliation, Western firms feeling the brunt of asset seizures, should we take an activist view of the Russian assets? I think that certainly ought to be in the price for anybody who's still doing business in Russia in a meaningful way.
All right, so let's turn now to the question of guaranteeing Ukraine's long-term security. Milena, when we were talking in the second segment, we mentioned the admission of Ukraine into NATO as one of the kinds of security guarantees that they might really need, and one of the things that Russia might really not want. What is the process for admitting a new NATO member state?
It's a fairly complex and lengthy process. It begins with accession talks with NATO headquarters in Brussels. The country that wants to join has to send a letter of intent to the NATO Secretary General. And then after that, so-called accession protocols have to be signed by all NATO members. There are currently 31 NATO member states. All of them have to sign the accession protocols. All of them have to be ratified by the relevant NATO countries' governments. And then ultimately, the NATO Secretary General will invite the potential member state to accede to the treaty, and then that state has to then become a member of the NATO treaty pursuant to its own national procedures. The last country that joined NATO was Finland. In the case of Finland, it took about a year, but that was as quick as it can be. So even if Ukraine said today we're going to join NATO, and even if all the NATO countries were in agreement, it would take some time before that could actually be done.
Well, let me turn to General Guthrie. Do you think it would be a good idea to admit Ukraine into NATO? What would be the pros and cons of that?
Yeah, so there are some absolute, I think, good things about it, both for Ukraine and NATO. So, for example, over the course of the war, you've really standardized towards NATO equipment. So whether it's, from the U.S., the U.K., or Germany, the equipment is now standard. And so for Ukraine, over time, I think the outdated Russian equipment that they had has gone by the wayside. And so now you've got a more sustainable and capable of providing battle-tested capabilities to the NATO alliance. And there's some value in that. You get to participate in NATO exercises and training with NATO partners, and indeed basing opportunities with NATO allies, like you see with the U.S. And Poland. These are all positives for Ukraine. If Russia remains a bad actor, and there's nothing that says right now that they're not, at least as long as Putin is alive, bolstering the southern flank of NATO is I believe, an overall plus. But there's a couple of downsides to that. And one of those is now you've got to prepare for a NATO that now has a much bigger border with Belarus and Russia. And then that means there's costs associated with that for preparing for and responding to the collective defense obligations that exist underneath NATO. And you'd be doing that with an economically devastated Ukraine. But kind of in conclusion, NATO has made some commitments to streamline the admission process for Ukraine. And I find it hard to think they're going to back away from that unless Ukraine was to ask them to do that.
All right, well, let me ask Milena, if membership in NATO fully is not going to be possible, are there other NATO light kind of options for guaranteeing Ukraine's security?
Well, Ukraine, like any other country in the world, is free to sign other bilateral or multilateral mutual defense treaties with other nations. And so Ukraine could turn to, for example, European partners or the U.S. or the U.K. and say, basically, let's conclude some kind of a mutual defense treaty whereby you guarantee my security. The nice part about NATO is that it involves 31 countries and that all of those countries have a treaty obligation to come to a NATO member's defense. If you conclude a smaller treaty, it's no longer 31 countries. It might be one or two or three. But there certainly are other options for Ukraine.
All right, now let's talk about Russia's accountability for war crimes. And I want to go to Daniel Bilek. Why is accountability so important to the people of Ukraine?
I was actually hoping to get something in on Ukraine's position in NATO.
Oh, you know what?
Okay.
Go ahead and do that.
Yeah, if you don't mind. Because,
Sure.
I
and then we'll
think
turn
that
back to
there's
this.
a lot of really important things that were just mentioned.
Okay.
Look, I think we're done with NATO light. It's the only, after the Budapest Memorandum, nobody believes anything short of NATO is going to guarantee our security in any meaningful way. You can have stopgap measures. I think Milena is absolutely right. I mean, we have we're having those discussions today. But NATO's role is to preserve the peace and security in Europe, and Ukraine is now, I think, recognized as a crucial component of that European security architecture. In fact, NATO needs Ukraine as much as Ukraine needs NATO, which I think was the general's point. And we're already a de facto member. We are already acting as the Eastern Shield of the alliance. We're the largest army in Europe, the only one with experience in fighting the enemy that NATO forces and equipment were set up and designed to defend against. And as the general points out, we actually did what NATO countries have not been able to do, and that's make their equipment interoperable. And NATO standards are being adopted in real time. And I come back to this is the last point I'll make, is that the only way there's going to be peace in Europe is if Russia loses the war in Ukraine. Every other scenario is going to cost infinitely more to the United States and its NATO allies than bringing Ukraine into the tent. And winning the war depends on the West. We're doing the fighting, we're doing the dying. All we ask for is give us everything we need to get the job done, and we can do it. And instead of putting efforts into not throwing us under the bus, I like to quote General Guthrie's colleague, General Hodges, that the United States especially needs to be in it to win it. And so I think that we have the irony is that we're fighting a war for the Eastern Shield of NATO, and Finland and Sweden get in, and we don't. So that would be a very bad outcome.
Daniel, I'm glad you
Letting
threw.
say that.
Yeah, I'm glad you threw that in, and I do want to return to the question I was about to ask you about accountability. Why is that so important to the people of Ukraine? And I'm
Yeah,
talking
look,
about Putin's criminal responsibility for launching the war and the war crimes.
Look, there is a huge demand for justice in this country. Obviously, I mean the suffering that people have gone through, especially in the occupied territories, is just atrocious. I mean, I think Paul talked about 20,000 abducted children who have been and the younger they are, they get put up for adoption into Russian families, and most of these kids have parents and families. Weaponization of rape as an instrument of war. I mean, and in fact, you listen to the telephone conversations between wives and Russian soldiers that have been captured by our military intelligence, and the wives are encouraging the men to brutally rape Ukrainian women so that they never want to have children. Gruesome acts of torture in all the occupied territories because people identify themselves as Ukrainian, and of course mass murder. Every town we've liberated, has just been an orgy of death. And you look at the Madrid summit last year, NATO actually changed its doctrine because of the way the Russians behaved. Now, the Poles, for example, their doctrine is not to pull back to the Vistula River near Warsaw and then fight to regain their territory, because they know that if they leave any part of their territory in Russian hands, their people are going to be slaughtered. So, so this is much more than just about Ukraine. It has implications for all states that experience sort of similar brutal wars of aggression. And this is really about fundamental principles of justice and the dignity of person that are at stake. If the rule of law is not going to have any meaning in international affairs if we can't bring perpetrators and masterminds of heinous human rights abuses to justice. I mean, it just goes to the core of everything we purport to believe in. We have to have the courage of our own convictions.
Yeah. And yet the International Criminal Court, which is also known as the ICC for short, it has so far only issued an arrest warrant against Russian President Vladimir Putin for, as Paul and you mentioned, the abductions. So let me turn to Milena Is the ICC likely to bring additional charges in the next few weeks, perhaps, or months? And what might those be?
Yes, Michael, I do think that the ICC will bring additional charges against Putin, and I think those additional charges would likely involve war crimes, such as, for example, targeting civilians intentionally, the torture and murder of civilians. By now, we've had very credible reports that a significant number of civilians has been both tortured and murdered at Bucha. We've heard about the bombing of a theater that was being used as a shelter in Mariupol. These are all war crimes, and I think in all likelihood, the ICC will look to expand those charges pending against Putin.
And Milena, let me ask as a follow-up, do you think it's important that these charges be there even though it is so unlikely that anybody's going to grab Putin and bring him to The Hague for trial?
Yes, absolutely. First of all, it has huge symbolic value, but also, as this, I'm going to borrow from your playbook, Michael, international criminal justice is patient and persistent. Other world leaders, such as Charles Taylor or Slobodan Milosevic, they never thought that they would be arrested and face justice, and yet they did. And so it is hugely important to pursue accountability through the ICC and perhaps through other courts and tribunals.
Wow, that hour went by super fast. It's time, unfortunately, to bring our program to a close. I want to thank our experts for sharing their expertise on what is likely to come next in the Russian-Ukraine conflict. Daniel Bilek, Daryl Guthrie, Kevin Nealer, Paul Williams, and Milena Stereo. Thank you so much for providing your insights about this very important topic. I'm Michael Scharf. You've been listening to Talking Foreign Policy.